My guest today is a Scottish journalist and editor who has spent more than 2 decades chronicling the culture and business of video games. She started early as a junior staff writer for GamesTM while she was still a teenager. Then, after earning a degree in German and Japanese from the University of Edinburgh, including a year studying in Japan, she became UK games editor at IGN, helping shape the site's global editorial strategy. She then launched and led Kotaku UK, where her team won multiple industry awards. Since 2018, she has been games editor at The Guardian newspaper, where she writes the widely read Pushing Buttons newsletter and appears regularly on television and radio as an expert on the medium. She is the co-author of You Died, the Dark Souls Companion, and her new book, Super Nintendo, How One Japanese Company Helped the World Have Fun, explores the cultural impact of one of gaming's most influential companies. Welcome, Keza Macdonald.
Hello, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Keza. So nice to see you. How's it been this week? Your book came out, 2 days ago? Something like that?
Yeah, it's quite a feeling having a book out, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been a really long road writing this book about Nintendo. I started thinking about it like 10 years ago. And then there was a minor delay caused by having 2 children in a pandemic. And then after dealing with those, I finally...
That was
Are you just
you,
personally for me? Yes, it was entirely my suffering that. But once I managed to get started on it in about, I guess, as of 2022, 2023, I started on it in earnest. So it was still a long time coming, and I'm really pleased to be done with it. I'm proud of it as well. I think it does a fairly good job at what it's out to do. It's
excellent, so good. And yeah, tell us, how did you approach Nintendo? You know, it's a big subject.
Yeah, so essentially I wanted to write about Nintendo because it was my route into video games. My first games were Nintendo games, and that's the story for millions of people. Many of people who will be listening now are folk who will have had their first gaming experience with Nintendo. Although less commonly in Europe, one thing that the Americans tend to forget is that in Europe, Nintendo really wasn't a thing. Until the 90s, there was the NES wasn't a big deal in the UK and Europe, obviously. But because it was my route into video games, it's also for me a route into talking about why video games are fun in the first place, why they've kept my attention for all these years. And I feel like if you want to understand video games, then Nintendo is what you need to get. If you understand how Nintendo works and how it brings joy to people, you can kind of get at the core of what makes video games as a whole so interesting and so beloved. And then also I've spent 20 years interviewing people at Nintendo, and I don't think there's anyone else who's kind of had such a sort of large archive of Nintendo interviews and who's spoken to so many different generations even of Nintendo developer. Except Satoru Iwata, who was Nintendo's 4th president, who interviewed pretty much everyone at that company.
He had an unfair advantage, I think, with paying all of their mortgages.
Yeah, his access was unparalleled. I do think he had a lost vocation as a games journalist, Iwata, although I think he probably did better out of being president of Nintendo than he would have done out of being a games journalist. So yeah, I had all this amazing material from all the years I've been working as a journalist, and that came in really handy as well. So I felt like I wanted to do it, and I could do it. It was something that I felt I had a really unique perspective on and done a lot of reporting on in the past. So that's why I chose to write a book about Nintendo specifically.
Yeah, and the book's kind of got a unique approach as well, because there have been sort of histories of video games written before, and specifically histories of Nintendo written before, but you kind of tackle it in quite an interesting way. Each chapter looks at a different beloved character or game or series or whatever. So what made you want to do it that way?
I didn't want it to be a chronology, because lots of people have done that very well before. There were plenty of really good kind of chronologies of Nintendo and its games. I wanted to write more of a cultural history. I wanted to write about why these games are important and how they've become important, not just when they came out and what console they were on and how they were made, but also what impact they had and how. And also it was a very useful way for me to talk about bigger themes that I was interested in. So Pokemon is a chapter about Pokemon and where it came from, but it's also about games as a vector of connection between people, which was a bigger theme I was interested in talking about. Mario, although being about the origins of that series, is also about the idea of kinetic play, joy of movement. and playfulness and childlike play. And then talking about Metroid gave me an opportunity to talk about how women have been portrayed in Nintendo's games and also video games more generally over the last 40 years. So yeah, every franchise gave me a route into a kind of bigger theme, like a cultural theme about Nintendo and about games. And so structuring around those different beloved characters and franchises, it means that everyone's favorite thing is going to be in the book. But it was also a way for me to make it a bit broader than just talking about the consoles and the games.
Yeah. Such an interesting company because, they're so known for being playful and joyous and, like you say, sort of being the route into video games for multiple generations of people and parents and now with their children and all of that. So lovely. Also quite a closed company through the decades. The fact that you've had so much access is very notable because they're not, it's not like every month they're trotting out one of their developers. They actually very rarely do that. And the reason that Iwata did all of those interviews during his tenure was, let's be honest, about control and about wanting to control the narrative and what was being said and all of that. So I wanted to ask you specifically because, you have interviewed the most famous person from Nintendo, Shigeru Miyamoto, the Walt Disney of video games. That was fairly recently, like a couple of years ago. I remember us messaging back and forth about it at the time. And tell me about that experience. How did it come about? What was it like walking into the room?
I spent about 2.5 years trying to arrange this interview with Miyamoto. And I was pitching it as a kind of a career retrospective because at the time he was going to turn 70. And I felt like it would be, I wanted it. I was thinking about the book a lot. I also wanted it for, my day job. I'm games editor at The Guardian. I thought it would make a fantastic cover story for The Guardian's culture section to have a kind of career retrospective for Miyamoto. So I was asking and talking about it for honestly a couple of years before it came together. And, all game publishers are like this. They like to tie everything to like an upcoming marketing beat, So we were waiting for like a new Mario game or a new Zelda game, something that they could, Nintendo's marketing people could feel like they were tying it to. And that just wasn't happening. Mario Wonder came and went, and I thought, you know what, I'm stuffed. And then basically I got a phone call just in the middle of a Wednesday saying, it's happening, can you come to Japan next week? And I was like, oh, yes, fine. Yeah, I'll do it. I'll come. And so it was very short notice. And like going inside Nintendo's headquarters is something that really very few people have done. I think you could probably count on two hands the number of Western journalists who've been inside there. So when they said
how far in did you get? Did you get past the lobby?
I did actually get past the lobby.
Yay.
So you walk into that high-rise building, right? And it's just a big grey building in the south of Kyoto with a sign outside it. And then you walk into the only thing, it's like a gleaming white lobby. And the only single thing that suggests that you might be anything exciting might be in there is a little basket of Mario plushies that's on the receptionist desk. That's it.
Like a dentist, you go to chew Mario to.
It's so much like a dentist's in there. It's very shiny and white and clinical. And then I got ushered behind these big security doors, and there were like meeting rooms, and there's like a whole kind of warren of rooms on the ground floor. And so I was in there and waiting in a meeting room, very, very generic looking meeting room as well. You wouldn't tell it was Nintendo. And then it was only when I was like, I went to find a bathroom, and I just ran around that entire floor, like looking for something interesting. Found nothing interesting. It was just a bunch of meeting rooms. There was like a Donkey Kong sprite.
It's excellent. I need the bathroom, but I don't need a chaperone.
Yeah, I'm sure I can find it myself.
Hurling yourself at doors trying to get in, and
that's journalism. It's
yeah,
it's my duty. But there was almost nothing distinguishing in there. There was like a cinema, like a staff cinema, in the ground floor, and there was like a sprite of Donkey Kong and some frosted glass. That's all I found. And then obviously when Miyamoto walks into any room, there's like 12 other people with him these days, like the chaperones of various descriptions, translators, etc. And so it's quite intimidating trying to do a good interview when you are being watched by a small crowd of people.
yeah, all waiting to jump in when you ask him if he's retiring.
Exactly. Yeah. But what I found really great about speaking to me, I had spoken to him before, but in a much more much less time, and a lot of other people were also there. But what was great about having that kind of, I think it was an hour and a half we got, was that he just really lit up when we started getting into the really nerdy nitty gritty. I did a few kind of general chat questions, and he politely answered them, and then we started talking about designing the GameCube, and he just lit up. Talking about the placement of the buttons, and then he got on one about the Nintendo 64 analog stick and the hexagonal guide and how many iterations of that they went through. And he has a real passion for the extremely tiny details of game development and console hardware development, which I really appreciate. I was loving listening to that. And obviously this is someone who's made some of my favorite games, so I was excited. I was excited to talk to him.
So good. And how do you, when you're in that situation, obviously you've grown up loving his games. It's a big deal meeting him, but at the same time, you're a professional. How do you stop from teetering into sort of being a bit fan-brained? Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I really do know what you mean. And the thing is, because I just purely because I've been doing this for so long now, I can usually be a pro in these situations. And I did find, because it was a very important interview, so I was really head in the game, jet lagged, but head in the game. And it was a strange experience because I expected to really feel something walking into Nintendo's HQ, and I really didn't. It just felt like a work day. And it was then actually the next day after that interview, after I'd done it, and I was like, okay, that went well, we're good. Hang on, siren.
It's Nintendo's coming to say, you're saying too much, Keza.
You're saying too much? I have wondered, Simon. They're very, as you know, they're very enthusiastic with their lawyers. It was the next day, actually, after the interview had gone well, and I'd felt I could excel finally. And I went to Nintendo World at Universal Studios in Osaka. And then I just turned into a giant child.
Right, yeah.
The second I walked into that theme park and there was the music and all that, they did such a good job with that theme park. All the Mario iconography. Oh, it really is like walking into a dream. It was, you walk through a green pipe into Peach's castle from Super Mario 64 with all the portraits and everything. And I was like, I was so excited. I just immediately became just the giant fangirl version of myself the second I walked in there. So that's actually what did it for me. That's what brought out the fan.
Oh, so nice. And did you get it? Once the piece came out, did you hear anything, were they displeased or did they just
you never do
pretended? Yeah.
Yeah, you never do hear from them. This is the thing. Whenever you do, you do these big interviews in your career, and you do wonder what they thought of it in the end. So often I've been like, I wonder what they thought of the interview, because I think very often about an interview with Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon. And he gave one interview to the Western press, basically. And it was in 1999. And the Time magazine.
Oh, yes, I remember the piece, yeah.
Yeah, and this piece was called Beware the Pokemania. And it was essentially a kind of 6,000-word teardown of Pokemon as a concept, video games in general, and Satoshi Tajiri as an individual. It was the way they described him, like a hollow-eyed, bloodshot monster. And they used sentences like, his monsters are a child's predilections and things like that. It was they painted him as a very sinister character. And it was one of the most disrespectful and alarmist articles about video games I think that's ever been published in the mainstream media that I've ever read.
Late 90s though, wasn't it?
Yeah, height of moral panic.
Yeah, it was not, the geek was not in ascendancy yet in the way that, regretfully, they are now.
I'd almost I read that article again when I was researching the book because it was relevant to my chapter about Pokemon, and I had forgotten just the sheer, it was almost like a yellow peril xenophobia alarmism around Pokemon
really?
In the late 90s. And I remember it as a kid, there was such a genuine, anger and concern from adults about Pokemon, the most harmless imaginable thing. But I think a lot about that interview with Satoshi Tajiri because he never gave another interview in his life. None. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't either, honestly, if I'd given that interview and then that article was what had resulted. So I do often wonder, if there, whenever you do a big interview with someone and you end up it becomes one of those profile pieces that is widely read. You do always wonder how the subject feels about it. And I always hope they don't hate it, you know?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because like journalistically, you kind of don't want them to be like, oh, this is great marketing for me. But at the same time, you like it from a human perspective, you kind of, you want to have treated someone with respect and reflect it, depicted them accurately and all of that stuff. So it's a weird feeling, I think.
Yeah, I always remember when you and I both went to Japan to see From Software when they were making Bloodborne. Yeah. And you did, for The Guardian as well, you did a profile of Hidetaka Miyazaki, which, because you made the revolutionary step of like just asking him about his life and his childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And things. And but that profile was like, it was cited everywhere because just nobody else had thought to ask those questions really of him. And I think that's what you kind of hope for, don't you? You want to have the answer to something that nobody else has thought of to ask, really. I think that's what you're aiming for as a journalist when you're interviewing a kind of big creative person.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right, Keza, we better come to the premise of the podcast. I've asked you to pick the 5 video games you'd like to put on your ideal fictional games machine. I got your list later than any other guest I've had on the show. I think about 3 minutes before we started talking. So I guess
that is on brand for me. It's very hard to narrow it down to 5, It's difficult.
Yeah. How did you go about picking them in the end?
I wrote a list of, I kid you not, 55 video games.
You did?
I just started thinking of all games that were important to me for one reason or another. And then I divided them into the eras of my life. And I'm like, okay, so I'm going to pick one from every era of my life. And then I managed eventually to pick 5. But it was really hard. I play a lot of games.
Yeah, cool. Well, I love the commitment. This is good. Okay, well, we're going back to a game you've actually already mentioned for your first one. It came out on the 23rd of June, 1996. Listeners, can you guess what it might be? Tell us, what's the game, Keza, and why do you love it?
It's Super Mario 64. The reason this game is important to me is because when I was a child, I wouldn't say technophobic, but certainly tech skeptical parents. So they weren't that keen on video games as a concept. And my introduction to games was actually sitting in the Sainsbury's in Edinburgh, reading Nintendo magazines and like just vividly hallucinating about what video games might be like, because I'd never played one. And my mum would let me buy the magazines, but I wasn't allowed a console. And so I had, by the time I was 6 or 7, I had a fairly encyclopedic knowledge of the video games of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System without ever having touched one, ever in my life. Not even at a friend's house, because no one had a SNES. And so I did eventually get a SNES, but I got it really late. I got it, I think, the Christmas of maybe 1995, I'm going to say. And so we finally got, my brother and I, we finally had a video games console. And we had, I think, 3 games ever for it. And those 3 games were Super Mario All-Stars, Mario Kart, and The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, which is a pretty good trio, I've got to say. Like, it's,
those are
if you're going to pick 3 games.
Yeah.
Yeah. But those games weren't, by the time the Nintendo 64 came out, my love for video games had really matured a little bit more, and it's starting to become really important to me. It was starting to become a passion. And so the first game I remember anticipating, like really looking forward to and being like, I cannot wait to play that, was Super Mario 64. And I begged and begged and begged and got a Nintendo 64 pretty soon after they came out. I think for my birthday was in the August, and I think they may have come out in the June or something. So it was quite soon after, and I was one of the first people in my friend group as an 8 or a 9-year-old, so nobody else had played it. And so the reason it's so special to me is because I had anticipated it. I'd wanted to play it. And then I remember taking those first steps into the game and just the feeling of just like sheer unparalleled delight of like,
Right.
finally it was happening. Finally, this was happening for me. That's a very powerful emotion that has stuck with me all these years. I still, whenever I see Mario, actually, I still just get this little like Madeline-esque echo of that first brilliant moment with Mario 64. The other thing I vividly remember about Mario 64, playing it for the first time, was not being able to move Mario forwards.
Oh,
because
right, yeah.
I'd never played a 3D game. None of us had, really.
No,
Not full
yeah.
motion 3D
Not
game. I
properly.
think, Mario 64. Yeah, Mario 64 was the first full range of motion 3D game. And so I was just trying to run him to the right, and he was just turning around and around in circles. And me and my brother and like 4 of our friends were just all trying to just run him forward in the gardens, in the castle gardens.
Right, you mean so like you're pressing right on the D-pad like you would on the Super Nintendo?
Yeah, we were pressing right on the analog stick, which just makes him go round and round.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it was
like, my game's broken.
Yeah, none of us could figure out how to do it. It was so funny. It took us a good kind of half hour. And that, I think, is something quite beautiful about what games were like in the 90s for children. Basically, you didn't know what on earth you were doing. And I was absolutely dreadful at most games. Like, I knew I'd get a new game and then I would barely be able to play it, And then you'd stick at it and you'd figure out how the controls yourself. You'd figure out how the controls worked. You'd use the language of the game to figure it out. And also, a lot of games were just a bit broken in the 90s and early 2000s too. So you had to work around that. Like Licky 2 got stuck all the time. You had to work on, how to maneuver that camera. And that feeling of like self-mastery that's something I still get a lot out of, is the feeling of not just mastering a game, but mastering yourself. There's some like development of skill. And the development of skill of moving a character in a 3D environment, it took us ages and ages. And then eventually I got every star in that game on every save slot as well. So I just started the next save slot down and then the next one down.
Like only a kid can do. Like, no,
right?
That's only one small period of life where you can fill up every save slot with that 100%. Amazing.
And this is, it's a beautiful period of life, actually, that it is just this complete monomania that children have about whatever their thing is. And my thing was, Nintendo when I was that age, kind of 8 to 12. It was just what I lived for. And I played everything I could. Although Nintendo games were so expensive, this is another thing that comes up often in this podcast. But like when you're a kid, you just play what you're given for half a year until it's Christmas, and maybe you might get a new one. Right. So I was enormously fortunate that the game I got was Mario 64. Like, you could play that for a year. Yeah, it was the best one. And then years later, when I was, I had my first job at GamesTM magazine. So I did when I was.
Well, don't do spoilers. We'll talk about this in a minute.
Oh yeah, we can do that. I was just thinking. I'm actually skipping ahead. Okay, I'll skip that.
All right, well, we'll come to that in a minute. But I do want to hear a bit more about you. At Sainsbury's reading these magazines. What was it? Paint a picture for us. Did you grow up in Edinburgh? Am I misremembering?
Yeah, I grew up in Edinburgh, which was at the time I felt like the most boring place in the world. I feel a bit differently about it now because I moved to other places, and I'm like, what? Edinburgh's actually incredible. It's if people come from all over the world to see Edinburgh, it's an amazing city. Basically, it's still there. There's a big Sainsbury's in Ravelston. And it was the classic thing where like your mum's doing the weekly shop and you're being annoying. But I was a voracious reader as a kid, so she'd just leave me in the magazine section. So I just treated it like a library, basically. I'd be sitting there reading. And Superplay magazine was the one that caught my... had incredible covers. They had this guy, Will Overton, I think he was called, who used to do the covers for Superplay, original like anime style covers, manga style covers. They looked awesome. So I read a lot of Superplay magazine, which then became N64 magazine during the late 90s, which I also read every issue of. I still have them somewhere. Read every issue of those magazines. And then, there was also an official Nintendo magazine, but I didn't like its tone. Even at like 6, 7, I was like, I don't like the tone of this one, so I didn't read that.
What was that then? Do you think you were reacting to?
Well, they would say, there was this thing they used to do where they'd call the PlayStation the Grey Station,
I see, yeah, right.
It was, they had a kind of weirdly defensive posture on that magazine.
I wonder if that was coming from the top, like from Kyoto, they're like... You must refer to the PlayStation as the Grey Station.
Yeah, and like and I don't know if I'm misremembering this, but I also remember like, okay, so all games magazines in the 90s were extremely sexist. Like,
Sure.
they just were. And, that was something I picked up on even kind of at 9, 10, 11. I was just picking up on. I didn't feel like it was for me as a wee girl. I just felt kind of excluded by a lot of the games magazines, the PC Zone particularly, which, I do. I remember picking up a copy of that when I was 11, and after about 4 pages of tit jokes being like, okay, this isn't for me. And then so the magazines that I ended up gravitating towards were the ones that were more aimed at kids, and the Nintendo magazines particularly. But that was I kind of decided when I was 7 I wanted to be someone who wrote these magazines, and then that is what I ended up doing as an adult. It was my dream. I have to remind myself sometimes that was my dream.
This is what you wanted.
Yeah, exactly. It's what I've always wanted.
You mentioned that your parents were sort of tech skeptics. What did they do? What sort of field were they in?
My mum, she was a personnel trainer, not a personal trainer, a personnel trainer. So she was like,
okay.
I guess these days would be, head of kind of HR training. So she used to teach kind of mini seminars and courses on, interpersonal skills, time management, how to manage people, like business skills, things like that. And so I would often sit in the back of one of her, because it was just me and my mum growing up until I was 5 or 6. So I would sit in the back of her seminars. She'd be teaching, lawyers or jewelry salesmen how to do, body language reading and stuff like that. And I'd be sitting there in the back with my crayons or reading a Nintendo magazine very often. And then my stepdad, who came into my life when I was 5, he was a charity fundraiser. But they were both quite old by kind of parental standards. My mum was in her mid-40s when I was born, and my stepdad was the same age. So they were just like, it was very new to them. Like, computers and technology were not, they were about probably, they would have been over 50 by the time we got our first games console. So they were just very skeptical about the whole thing. And I had to do a series of, I remember making a PowerPoint presentation when I was 11 about why I should definitely have a Game Boy.
Oh, wow. Gosh.
And they had animations, like the whole thing. Like I put my heart and soul into this PowerPoint presentation, because I was like, if I put this in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, my mum will be impressed.
We had a guest on last year, Claire L. Evans, who made Blippo, that game last year. And she did exactly the same thing, except for a hamster, I think. She had to make a PowerPoint presentation while she was allowed. So there's something about young women
business
with that
moms,
sort of, yeah, getting into games.
Yeah, it was great. They very much, the thing is, they kind of did support my passion for games. They never understood it. Certainly not when I was younger. They eventually got it, but they always supported it. They never ridiculed it as some people did at that time.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's come to your second choice, and then we'll head into how you broke into the media industry as a child.
Great.
Your first game comes from March 2003. It was a PlayStation 2 game first, I believe. Tell us, what was it?
Amplitude by Harmonix. So this was a rhythm game. It was a rhythm action game. And it was mostly entirely electronic and dance music. And you played a little spaceship, and you used the L1, R1, R2 buttons to play the tracks. And so the songs were all broken up between like the bass, the vocal, like Guitar Hero, but like Rock Band, and the various melody tracks. And you would be flipping back and forth between each track of the music, blasting the notes, and then trying to kind of keep your streak going. And this was all presented in a very kind of 90s club aesthetic, like early 2000s, actually Y2K club aesthetic, not 90s. Like there'd be like a tunnel of beats, and it was very, very trippy. And I was about 14 or 15 when I picked this game up. By this point, my Nintendo obsession had broadened. I got a PlayStation 2, and I was writing about video games for a very embarrassing Nintendo and other game fan site that is, thank God, no longer on the internet. And so I spent a lot of time broadening my gaming taste as a teenager. And there were two kind of areas that I ended up specializing in. One was like weird Japanese stuff, like all weird Japanese stuff from the early to mid 2000s. And then the other thing was rhythm games, music games. They were a really strong interest of mine and a passion, and also a thing that ended up influencing me going and living in Japan, because a lot of rhythm games, they came from Japan, and the kind of home of them was Japanese arcades. But Amplitude was Western. It was an American game. And it was really brilliantly constructed, really well done. It kind of took cues from Beatmania and Guitar Freaks and all these 90s Japanese rhythm games, but they made such a slick, brilliant package. And I found it absolutely hypnotizing. I remember because the PlayStation 2 version had these leaderboards that I became troublingly obsessed with. So I was top 1% in the world at Amplitude. I was obsessed with it. I remember like every time, every week I'd kind of come home, check the leaderboards, and if I'd slipped a couple of places on the leaderboards, I'd be spending 2 or 3 hours trying to get a better streak. Yeah, it really, really captured me. And it opened my eyes to a sort of new type of gaming, like that real flow state gaming. I'd never played much. I missed the arcade era, basically. I was too young for it. And so I missed this and the shmup era. And I also never was any good at fighting games. And these are all games of like extreme pattern recognition and flow. And so my version of that was music games, and Amplitude was the first one that really got me.
So good. Yeah, Frequency and Amplitude are just two of the best games of that era, I think. And are they playable now, either of these games, or not?
Well, you can go out and buy a copy of Amplitude in a PlayStation 2. You can still do that.
Sure,
but
yeah.
One thing that did happen, Frequency was the prequel. Well, not the prequel. What did I get on?
The one that
Frequency
came before,
was the game before. Yeah. And it was also a PlayStation 2 game. But I just didn't think it was quite as good. They had a hexagonal kind of tunnel, and it wasn't quite as I didn't like it. It didn't get into my brain as much. It didn't kind of get my synapses firing quite so well. The other way you can play Amplitude now is that they kind of resurrected it for the PlayStation 4, and they ran a Kickstarter. So Harmonix obviously went on to make Guitar Hero and went on to make Rock Band, but somehow Harmonix never really made all that much money out of Guitar Hero or Rock Band, which is really tragic. So they wanted to make another Amplitude game, and they ran a Kickstarter, and it really looked like this Kickstarter wasn't going anywhere. It looked like it was gonna, fail. And I remember in a fit of absolute madness pledging $500 to this Kickstarter, because all I wanted in my life was for Amplitude to come back. I was like, I was so keen on it. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, the game made it over the line at the last second. So Amplitude is now the game I've spent the most money on, and probably will spend the most money on in my entire life, because I paid $500 for that PlayStation 4 remaster of it all those years later.
Well, worth every cent.
Yeah. I regret nothing.
All right, then let's come back to your story, Keza. So tell us, how did you become a junior staff writer at GamesTM when you were 16 or however old you were?
So I spent a lot of time hanging out on video game forums when I was 14 onwards. And so I did have this game fan site that I ran with a bunch of random dudes, from the internet. And they would come, we would have these meetups. And they would come to my parents' house, pitch tents in my parents' garden, just these, a bunch of Belgian teenagers, a couple of random students from north of England. My parents would be like, who are these people? I'm like, oh, these are just my friends from the internet. No big deal. And so through hanging out on these forums and writing quite a lot, obviously bad, but writing a lot for these games websites. I ended up meeting someone who then got a job on GamesTM magazine, and he got me work experience when I was 16 at school. And so by the time this happened, I wasn't completely terrible at writing, because I'd already spent several years, writing online. And so I went to do this work experience on GamesTM magazine, and I did I did a week, and they went, "Can you do another week?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll do another week." And then at the end of those 2 weeks, they were like, "Do you want a job?" And I was like, "Absolutely." So I called up my mum and I was like, "Hey, good news, I'm not coming home."
Good news.
Which you can imagine that went down very well. So I'm technically a high school dropout. I dropped out of school when I was 16 to go and work on a games magazine, which, as you can imagine, everyone thought was a great idea at the time. Every adult in my life was like, "Oh, great, brilliant, love that for you."
It's so funny. I heard you on the Today program on Radio 4 a few weeks ago talking about online safety for children, and I just feel like before you give your advice, you should give someone this backstory that as a teenager you invited some Belgian boys to sleep in your garden from the internet.
Absolutely. Internet stranger. It was just a different time, like 2003. Internet was not the same as Roblox. It just wasn't the same. And my parents obviously had no idea about internet safety because it was a completely new thing. They did express, bless them, some concern about all the random boys I was talking to on the internet. But very genuinely, we were just discussing Zelda, man. Like, we're swapping tips on random PlayStation 2 Japanese imports. It was very wholesome.
Very wholesome, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, you call up your mum and you say, "Look, good news, I've got this job." What actually happens then? Because I assume you weren't allowed to just stay there indefinitely.
No, so I did come back to basically, pack up my stuff and go. But I managed to get, like, I was living in a terrible flat share. This was in Bournemouth. This magazine was based, and I was, everyone was pretty young, not as young as me, but pretty young. But one of the things that Amplitude comes into is when I first started out this magazine, everyone was so skeptical. Firstly, because I was so young, but then also I was a girl. There weren't any other girls. There were no other women or girls. I think there was one. But other than me, really very, very few other women or girls in the whole of the games media. And certainly in that office, there weren't many of us. There were two of us there in the whole place. And so everyone was very skeptical of me. And I felt a kind of very strong urge to prove myself. I felt like that was a kind of imposed on me. And one of the things that I did have going for me at the time, is that I am very good at games. Like, apart from Street Fighter, which I suck at, most games I certainly as a teenager I was pretty damn good at games. And so I sat in the games room in GamesTM magazine and stuck Amplitude on, and just played through the whole thing on expert.
Nice. Been training for this moment for years.
I know. People would come in and they'd just watch for a bit, and then I remember one of the guys, he'd go out and bring in another few guys. By the time it got to the really hard songs, I had a crowd of guys, and I was like, I was killing it. I was really
like Marty McFly in Back to the Future when he's playing guitar. Come and see this kid.
The nerdiest, saddest version of that you can imagine. It was these songs on Amplitude, man. I remember there is actually there's a Slipknot song in it. And the lyric goes, "We are the anti-cancer, you know the answer." But to me, it just always sounded like "We are the anti-Keza," because it really does sound like that. And it's a really hard song, and I was always failing around that bit. Anyway, I had, so Amplitude was the way I ended up sort of getting some kind of gamer cred at this office full of skeptical young men who didn't think I belonged there. So I have a fond memory of Amplitude for that. It was a really good moment for me. At that age, I mean, for the record, I think it's completely ridiculous that anyone should have to do that. It's mad that you should get a job and, have to prove that you were really, really good at video games so that, and that's why you belong there. I mean, that is mad, but that was the situation.
Yeah, you think the writing would be more important.
You would, but it completely wasn't. It really wasn't. It's just as well, because I still sucked at that. I was only 16. My writing wasn't the best.
And then, so what kind of, once you've proven yourself in the arena of Amplitude, what kind of things were you doing? Was it mainly, previews and reviews, or how did you cut your teeth in these very early days?
Yeah, it was old school games magazine stuff. So we would be previewing games that were coming up. And one thing that surprised me to learn was that we weren't playing them. We were just writing information about the games, having never seen them, you know? So it really was just look at screenshots, look at information, figure something out. And so you'd be trying to write this like double page spread on. I remember like I had to write a preview of Okami, which was the kind of painterly Zelda like coming out of Clover Studio. And I was like, I don't know anything about this game. And they were like, just figure it out. And that was very much how previewing used to work. Previewing isn't really a thing anymore in the games media. You know, we don't do it because it is basically made up. Like we were just making it up. Sometimes you'd go to a studio, talk to people, play the game. That was always amazing. But sometimes you couldn't do that because the magazine had to have every game that was coming up, whether or not you'd got the opportunity to play it. And then I also did a lot of the really boring bits of the magazine that nobody wanted to do because I was the junior staff writer. So I had to do the release date pages, which, love a release date page. Like, I'd have to write other people's captions a lot. I did a lot of other people's transcription. I'm still very fast at transcription because of these experiences.
Right, yeah.
And although AI's kind of stolen that skill from me now. And then I also did reviews, and I would be given pretty rubbish games to review most of the time. And so I did a lot of reviews of, like, the first game I ever reviewed professionally was this game called, I think, Tequila Overdrive. Which,
right.
I mean, really unmemorable PlayStation action game. And then, but the December, so I'd started out in the August of that year, 2005, but then in the December of that year, I begged and begged and begged to be given Shadow of the Colossus. And that was the first kind of really great game that I got to write about. And, you know, I felt really proud, like I really worked hard on that review. It's a wonderful game. I wanted to do it justice. And, you know, from then on, I started to be able to write more interesting things. I started to be able to write features. I had sub-editors on that magazine who would really kick my ass, which is something that a lot of young writers don't get now. You don't get staff job. You don't get the sub-editor and the editor just really redlining you and properly kicking your ass. The sub-editor on GamesTM was a legend. She later won Mastermind, I think. Like, she's
nice.
She was great. So she really helped me to, you know, improve fast as a writer.
Yeah, just explain what a sub-editor is for people who aren't journalists.
They're the people who they tidy up your writing. The editor is the person who's like, you need to explain this better, or you need to add more here, or you need to remove that. But then the sub-editor is the person who takes the copy and then just makes it really lovely and readable. So they're not only are they doing the semicolons and the commas and sorting all that out for you, but they're also making sure that you're being clear and that you're keeping to house style. So the sub-editor can really kick you up the bum if you're being waffly, which I was a lot as a teenager. I was very pretentious.
And make you look good as well. Yes.
Yeah. I honestly think an awful lot of writers from history, without their editors and sub-editors, they wouldn't have the reputation they have. Like, these people rule. They're a really kind of key part of the of old magazines, and they're still around on newspapers and magazines now, like the big ones. But otherwise, they've kind of been lost. I never had a sub-editor on a website, which I think is a huge loss.
All right, Keza. Well, we're going to come to your third game, which I'm so excited about. I have to say, I was hoping you'd pick this one because I know some of the story behind it. So, this game is from 2009. Tell us what's the game and why do you love it?
The game is From Software's Demon's Souls. So this game, after I did a year on GamesTM magazine, I went back to university because I'd promised my parents I would do that. I'd promised them that I would do university. They were very keen on it. It was the deal. And, you know, in 2006-07, university still seemed like a good idea and wasn't inordinately expensive. So I went to do a degree in German and Japanese at the University of Edinburgh. And I did this degree because I loved languages. Germany and German were just like a personal passion of mine. Always loved that. But I did the Japanese part so that I could go spend a year in Japan. I'd always wanted to understand Japanese gaming culture. Most of my favorite games had come from Japan, and I felt really strongly that I wanted to go live in Japan, mostly for video game related reasons. And so while I was living in Japan, I picked up a lot of work from magazines and websites just talking about Japanese games. I learned, my Japanese was never amazing, but it was good enough. So I learned to read and write and speak Japanese and could therefore kind of work out these games that other people couldn't play and then write about them in English. And one of those games was, I swear to you, I was in Nagoya, where I was living, in a secondhand game shop, and they had a very small selection of new games at the front. And I was flipping through, and the fourth or fifth game in, I picked it out, and it had like a knight on the cover, and then it had the From Software logo. And I would loved Armored Core, the incredibly complicated robot series that From Software had done. And I'd also played this game called Kingsfield, which was a miserablest PlayStation 1 role-playing game, like so hard, like so bleak. But I played it out of curiosity. And so From Software alone, I thought, this is probably worth a go. And that game turned out to be Demon's Souls, which obviously most people know what Demon's Souls is now. It's the game that came before Dark Souls. It's, basically kickstarted an entire incredibly popular genre. But at the time, it had only been released in Japan and Asia because Sony had funded it and basically thought it was a dud. So this PlayStation 3 action RPG, it only existed in Japan at that time. And I took it home and I played it, and I immediately became thoroughly obsessed with it. I remember like doing the first kind of intro level, and then you're in this hub world called the Nexus, and you have the choice of these archstones that you can touch that take you to different places. And I touched the fifth one, took about 4 steps in, and then the skeleton comes somersaulting down the hill and kills me in 3 hits. And I was like, okay, all right, what's going on here actually? And the next thing that happened, I managed to get past the skeleton, and then there were these kind of flying manta rays in the sky, and I was sort of looking up at them in awe, and then one of them shot a bolt at me and killed me immediately. And I was like, God damn it, what is going on in this game? And so I became really, really, really entranced by this game, and there was a very, very small community of people who were also playing it. I'm talking like maybe 100 people, if that. And there was a wiki, there was a Demon's Souls wiki that everyone was sort of contributing to. There was a Hong Kong version of the game that had sort of English, like some English in it. So basically I ended up making my way through Demon's Souls with the help of like this wiki and some other people who were playing a very niche game. And then I kind of asked my editors at Eurogamer, I was like, look, I found this game, bear with me. I found this game. No one's going to have heard of it. It's only out in Japan and Asia. Will you please let me review it though? Because I think it's one of the best things I've ever played. And they were like, they properly indulged me. They were like, fine, it's another one of Keza's weird Japanese games. But that review, like, it really kind of kickstarted a kind of wave of interest in Demon's Souls. And people started importing it from Hong Kong. And then eventually Demon's Souls, on the strength of that, it wasn't just me, obviously, there were other people who subsequently wrote about Demon's Souls and played it. And it got this like buzz going. And then from then, it got picked up for a release in America. And then it got picked up for release in Europe. And then from that, Dark Souls eventually got commissioned by Bandai Namco. So it's an occasion on which, like, as a writer, I was a very small part of a game's like journey to success. And if it hadn't been for, those few hundred people that were playing Demon's Souls back then and who understood it when Sony really didn't, the people at Sony didn't understand that game, but there was people who played it really. Some of us really understood it. And that if that hadn't happened, if there hadn't been that like groundswell of like grassroots support for Demon's Souls, then we wouldn't have gotten Dark Souls probably. And this whole genre of games like wouldn't be the way it is. And so it's one of the only occasions where I genuinely feel like I was part of something. Like I made a little bit of a difference in
definitely
in a game's success. And then from then on, like that became the Souls series is a very career defining kind of one for me. Not just because of Demons, but then Dark Souls as well. I remember speaking to Hidetaka Miyazaki, who obviously is now the head of From Software, lead creative behind a whole sheaf of fantastic games now that are deeply beloved. He's one of the most studied figures, I think, in the whole of of gaming. You know, their entire YouTube channels devoted entirely to forensic dissection of Miyazaki's work. And I think that's so wonderful that that's happened because his games are so interesting. But I spoke to him for the first time in 2009 when, I mean, he was very, very, very shy. Like, he struggled to look up from the floor during that interview. And also getting to see him go from being this really shy game designer who was kind of, you know, he was kind of given a failing project and, you know, nobody expected much of him. Seeing him go from that to being like the CEO of From Software and also, you know, a really aspirational figure as a game developer, like creatively, but then also like clearly has great business sense. Just seeing that guy's journey, having stuck around as a games journalist for so long, every time I speak to Miyazaki now, it just feels really meaningful and good to be able to be like, to follow that guy's career as a journalist. It's been really cool. So Demon's Souls was, firstly, I loved it. It was an amazing game, but it was also, as like a journalist and a writer, it was an important game to me.
Amazing. Yeah, and I've got to say, I imported Demon's Souls after reading your piece. You know, it was a time when
Wow.
I did, when Eurogamer was, you know, really at its height of powers, I think. So it was, you know, anything that was posted on there like that was widely read and influential. And so I think you're being modest. I think you did have a genuine major impact on getting that game over to the West. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing I can contribute to the world, like getting the Souls games brought to the West is probably a pretty good one.
Great. Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time and we've got a lot to cover. So tell us about, give us a whistle-stop tour of you joining IGN, which is obviously, you know, GamesTM was kind of the rival to Edge, you know, a lot younger in the tooth than Edge, and then eventually closes. Moving from that to IGN, that's a big step. IGN is a global brand with, you know, many readers. How was that journey for you? What was it like when you arrived?
Yeah, I'd started on the on forums, ended up on a magazine. When I went back to university, I spent those 4 years writing freelance for Eurogamer and, you know, other websites at the time and other magazines. I wrote for Edge quite a bit at that time as well, which was, you know, I was a pretentious teenager. I was so excited to be writing for Edge. It was amazing. It was really fun. But that's how I got myself through university. I didn't have to do, you know, too many jobs. Like, I did do door-to-door sales for a bit, but I didn't have to do too much waiting tables or anything like that. I was mostly making a living out of my writing. And then after I graduated, I moved to London and I spent a little while kind of scrabbling around doing as much freelance as I could. And then I got a call from Alex Simmons, who still I think works at IGN UK, but they were looking for specifically a UK games editor. And IGN at the time, very male-dominated site, very broad site. They did games. Obviously, games were what they were most famous for, but they also did movies and, at the time, Babes and various other things. Yeah, IGN Babes, remember that? That was a thing.
All right. You had to preview Babes, did you?
Yeah, you know, basically there was just this one guy, the one guy that ran the Babes section. We'll knock it into him.
Tips and cheats.
Yeah. But it was a huge website. And obviously it was just an enormous opportunity to write about games for an audience of millions and also an international audience. At the time, IGN was really segregated. They had like a UK site and a US site and I think an Australian site, but they all were separate. We'd run separate reviews for every game. And when I joined, I thought that this is a bit silly. This is a waste of effort. I thought it was ridiculous. So I spent quite a lot of time with my colleagues at IGN UK trying to turn it into a global games website, so that if a British reviewer reviewed a game, that was the IGN review. You know, if an American reviewer reviewed, that was the IGN review, and to make it a more kind of unified team, because there were great, especially at that time. So this was 2010, and at that time there was an enormous amount of advantage to having teams in different time zones. For news, firstly, because, you know, stuff would happen during the day and, you know, the Americans would wake up at 5 p.m. our time. So we could have like a whole sheaf of news ready, like good news done. And before they even woke up in the day. And then also while we were asleep, a lot of stuff would happen on Californian time. So sort of turning IGN into a real kind of 24-hour global kind of gaming news outlet was something that I felt quite passionate about and that, you know, I did help achieve there. And one of the things I got to do was review Dark Souls. That was a big deal for me at the time. But we spent about a year sort of trying to integrate the sites, and then we finally kind of got it feeling pretty good as a global site. And then Dark Souls came out in 2011, and we had the exclusive review for it, and it was, oh my god, the pre-release version of Dark Souls was so hard. It was so much harder even than the release version of Dark Souls. And everybody who was playing it before, I think you were on this email thread, weren't you? Where
Yeah,
like
I was
everyone
on that chain.
Oh, the chain of pain. Yeah.
Yeah.
The email thread. We had all the reviewers and guides writers were on this thread, like trying to share just how on earth to survive.
It was the frogs that cursed you. Do you remember?
Yeah.
They would take down, and that book in the pre-release version, every time you got cursed by that like green mist, your health bar or stamina bar, one of them, halved, but it just kept stacking.
Yeah. So you'd have a 16th of a health bar.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, this is unworkable now.
It was awful. I wasn't the only one who had this experience, but like I got stuck down. There was like the hollow tree, and I got stuck down there being continually killed by basilisks. So I got to the bottom of it, to the Ashen Lake with a 16th of a health bar, and then there's nothing there. You just have to try and climb back up and get through a poison swamp with a 16th of a health bar. It was insane. And then the other thing is we couldn't figure out how to cure the curse, could we? Like everyone was trying to figure out like what would work, and it turned out there was this one item, but you had to get all the way up to where the gargoyles were to get this one curse stone that would cure. It was insane. Like it was so hard. And we tried our best, but I don't think one single person got past Ornstein and Smaug in that build. It was too hard. So IGN's first ever 24-hour live stream was me playing Dark Souls. I flew over to San Francisco to play Dark Souls for 24 hours on stream, and I got about 12 hours in and I just basically collapsed on the couch in the background of the video. And I was kind of heartened by the fact that, you know, I woke up again about 10 hours later or whatever. Nobody else could do it either, man. Like not a single person, none of the guys, no one in that entire building could do Ornstein and the Smaug. So I felt slightly less bad for having been unable to get past them.
Yeah.
I did every single other thing you could possibly do in that game.
Yeah, you should have put on Amplitude. Done a couple of levels.
I should have put on Amplitude. Yeah, just to make up for the fact that we were defeated entirely. But yeah, working for IGM was a very it was a mixed experience for me, to be honest, because this was also the time, kind of 2010, 11. There wasn't a great deal in terms of like feminist thinking certainly in mainstream games websites. So I was taking a lot of quite bad like misogynist abuse from our readership at IGN. And my bosses didn't really care. I remember like trying, because I really felt it was important that we, you know, moderate the comments and things. And we were on YouTube a lot as well. And YouTube is, everyone knows what YouTube comments are like. So there was a lot of like, I did deal with an awful lot of disrespect from the audience that I found really quite aggravating. And I didn't get an enormous amount of support from like my higher ups in terms of dealing with that.
Because I think it's worth just saying that the scale of the website, I mean, this is a website that's probably at that time, you know, rivaled The Guardian now in terms of like the number of people that are going on it. You don't need many of those to be awful people to make your life a complete misery, right? As a percentage of the whole audience.
Right. It's like 100 million readers, I think it had at the time. But it was crazy. It was huge website. And I really feel like, you know, if you are running a platform of any kind, you have a responsibility to sort of dictate the tone. And that's something that is now accepted online, you know, like if you're going to have comments, you're going to moderate those comments. If you're going to, you know, your staff are going to have to feel safe at work, or at least feel respected at work. But in that era of the internet, and it was also, you know, social media was quite new at this time. You'd have Facebook integration, all this kind of thing. So it was just, there's floods and floods of reader input suddenly. And nobody had quite, they still haven't figured out how to moderate that stuff, like anywhere. You know, Facebook has never figured out how to moderate this. So that was a difficult thing about working for IGN that I found quite hard. And what really kind of brought that to a head was eventually Gamergate. Like Gamergate, which was a essentially targeted harassment campaign against women in the games industry. In 2013, that was when people started really paying attention to the kind of scale and nature of the misogyny that was kind of directed at women working in games at that time. Before that, people didn't really take it very seriously. And so when you were on an enormous website with a huge platform like that, and you're reviewing games like I was, like, you know, hardcore games, as it were, things like Dark Souls, Grand Theft Auto 5 I reviewed for IGN, the nature of the reader feedback was unpleasant. And after a few years, I got really sick of it. And I felt very passionate about changing it somehow, if not at IGN, then elsewhere. And I think that when I was working there, I was enjoying the work so much and I was enjoying the games so much, but I was starting to see that kind of online media was going in this direction of kind of anarchy direction that I didn't particularly love. There was a real sense of irresponsibility from the platforms that I felt really needed to change.
All right, well, let's talk about something a little bit brighter for a moment. We'll come to your fourth game, released in March 2017. It's your second Nintendo title. Tell us about this one, Keza.
This is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The reason I picked this Zelda is because it came along at another very defining time in my life. I just had my first child when Breath of the Wild came out. My baby was 6 months old. And so two things were happening for me. Firstly, I was having a real reckoning with my relationship with video games and my career, because as may have been obvious from the entirety of this podcast so far, I was a real workaholic in my 20s, and I was really committed to games and games journalism. I felt like it was my whole life, basically. I was so passionate about it. And then I was starting to have some negative experiences that were starting to make me kind of really think about what I wanted out of my career and how much of myself I was willing to give to it, really. And then having children was another like really major step in that kind of trajectory for me, where I was like, what actually am I doing here? And is this what I want to be doing with my life? So I was having all these questions. And then Zelda Breath of the Wild came out and just really reminded me why I do this, like why I love games, and why I got into them in the first place. I think that Zelda, well, I know that Zelda was created always with this intention of this bringing freedom, a sense of freedom to players. The idea of being able to dictate your own route through a game and bring your own imagination and curiosity into a game world and have that be rewarded and responded to. And the whole story of the Zelda series up until that point was of technology improving and that idea just beginning to sort of strain against the conventions of the Zelda series. You know, like path, dungeon was not really working for Zelda anymore. It needed to find a way to break free. Firstly, of the technological constraints, and secondly, of its own kind of like its own rules that it had created for itself. And then Breath of the Wild was the game that busted it right open. And you really could finally go wherever, do whatever. The game would respond to you. It felt like the world that I think Miyamoto envisioned from the first Zelda. I think Breath of the Wild is the thing that really encapsulates the spirit of that series, which is my favorite series. So I was playing Zelda all the time when my baby was sleeping, sometimes when my baby was not sleeping. I learned to feed my baby lying down so that I could hold a Switch while I was feeding my baby.
Gamer mum.
Yeah, man. Like the other thing is when you have a newborn child, especially if you're the birth parent of that child, then you have to have some kind of root to who you are as a person, because you get so like caught up in being a parent, being a mom, that it's really, and you're not sleeping, you know, no one's sleeping and everything's very new and intense, and you kind of lose connection to like who you were before that. And so Zelda really helped bring me back. When my child was 6 months old, it helped me bring me back to myself, and that's why it's a really special game to me. But it also brought me back to like my career and like why I love games, what interests me about games, and it helped to kind of remind me that it was what I wanted to be doing, and I was looking forward to going back to it.
Wonderful. Oh, lovely stuff, Keza. All right, well, let's zoom forward a little bit. I know you obviously work for Kotaku UK for a while. But then you move into mainstream and newspaper writing and all of that, which is another big change again for you. Tell us, what was it like the first time you you turned up at The Guardian. How did it feel different to your previous experiences?
It was, it's very, very different because you go from being, working for places like IGN and Kotaku, especially when I was running Kotaku, which in some ways is the best job I've ever had. I loved running Kotaku. It was a really, huge attitude, very like speak truth to power kind of Gawker media. It just didn't give it. It didn't care at all. There was none of this like at IGN. There was on the marketing side, there was a lot of cozying up to publishers and there was a lot of cozying up to the audience as well, actually. And Kotaku was like, no, actually, here's what we're doing. We're deciding the tone. We're deciding what's important, and like you can love it or hate it. Like that's how it's going to be. I really enjoyed it. I had such a good time working for Kotaku. My colleagues were so talented as well. Like I was working with people like Patricia Hernandez and Stephen Totillo and Jason Schreier and Evan Narcisse, who are all just great.
Good team.
I had such a good time. It was a great team. I really enjoyed it. Had a great time working at Kotaku. But when I had my kids, I remember coming back, my first baby, I remember coming back to work feeling really positive and then realizing that I just simply couldn't put the amount of time into games anymore that you really kind of need to if you're writing for that audience. Like I was struggling to, Destiny had just come out, I think. And I remember like everyone in my life was obsessed with Destiny, was putting like 10 hours a day into it. And I was like, I can't do this. Like this is not the kind of gaming I can do anymore. And I remember writing about that experience on Kotaku and getting a lot of really kind of, the backlash was quite big, I remember. Because some Destiny streamers picked up on that article and they were like, oh, if you can't play games properly, then what are you even doing this for? And I remember being like, whoa, I don't know, man. And so I was kind of looking for a different way to write about games. And when The Guardian called me up, first it was a 3-day-a-week job. And at that point, I was like, do you know what? That works for me because it gave me time to spend with my child. And I actually did need to just take the gas off a little bit. I'd worked myself into the ground over the previous, at that point, 13 years. And I'd achieved a lot, but I was tired and I really needed it to be less intense. So I took that 3-day-a-week job at The Guardian doing video games. And suddenly you go from the most important thing in the world is getting this Grand Theft Auto preview live. Like it has to be on embargo. Everyone's going to be talking about it. You go from that to like, oh, okay, so Ai Weiwei is in conference today. We're all going to be listening to, and it's like no one cares. And you're in morning conference and people are like, at the time it was Syria. The Syrian war was in full swing. So you'd be talking about Syria, like what's going on there, what's going on in Westminster, all this stuff would be happening. And then I'd be there like, there's a new Mario game out. It's very interesting. And it gave me such a necessary perspective check on games, actually. But in addition to that, like in addition to that, it also made me realize like why, like people do need to read about films, games, movies, TV, culture. They need that escape, man. Like arts criticism is really important. Like people really rely on it and they love it. And doing something that people love and that people get joy from is important in its way. And writing about games for a kind of bigger, broader audience like that really suited me at the time and suits me now, I think. I feel like an ambassador from the world of games. I go away, do my nerdy stuff, talk to my nerdy people, and I come back and I'm like, hey, here's a good story. Here's like the thing that everyone needs to know about from this world that I know inside out and that I love. And that's kind of how I've approached it at The Guardian. Like I try and find the things from games that are particularly interesting or relevant and like bring that to everybody. And the other thing that is unique about the audience I write for now, there's so many people out there who play games a bit or who loved games when they were a kid but fell off them, but they're still interested. And, they don't know everything. And they don't need to know everything. They can just maybe play 2 or 3 games a year or even just 1 game a year. But you can be the person that tells them that 1 game a year that they go, oh, that's really cool. I'll give that a try. And that's like a whole different thing from writing for the, ultra engaged specialist audience, which I also love and will always love. But I find there's something differently rewarding about writing for a slightly broader and less specialist reader. It's an interesting creative challenge, and it's also, I think there's some value in it.
And then I suppose with that profile and you learning how to communicate, becoming an interpreter for the games people in the public sphere. That has led, as I say, to lots of opportunities for you. I hear you on mainstream radio and the BBC and things like that whenever things come up. How did you find that suddenly becoming a bit of a spokesperson for the industry? Was that daunting, or did it feel comfortable?
I spent the first 12 to 13 years of my career being essentially ridiculed whenever I went on the radio or TV, like mainstream appearances. I remember going on to talk about Grand Theft Auto when it came out, and I was at Tokyo Game Show, so I was at the BBC's little office in Tokyo, and I was in there talking to someone on one of the BBC radio stations who, in the middle of this interview in which I was trying to explain Grand Theft Auto and how kind of popular it was, in the middle of this interview, the guy interrupted me and said, when I speak to people like you, I really think, why don't you read a book? And it really, really stuck with me, because firstly, at that point, I was like, well, I have a literature master's. I've read some books, man.
Did you say that? How did he react when you said that? Oh, you should have said that.
Just kind of scoffed. I did say it. I'm pleased I said it. I didn't just say it in my head. I said it out loud. It wasn't a live interview, sadly. So
punch him with War and Peace. Pull it out of your bag.
I've literally read Infinite Jest. I did that for my degree. Oh, it was, but that was the tone. And, it takes me back to that Pokemon article as well. The tone when I was growing up was that intelligent people don't play these things. Girls don't play these things. Women don't play these things. Smart people don't play these things. Games were just really, ridiculed actually as an art form. And I think sometimes fairly, if we're looking back, games in the 90s, sometimes it was deserved, but mostly it wasn't. And I've always felt very strongly about changing people's kind of opinion about just opening people's eyes a little bit, maybe opening their hearts a little bit to games, even if they're not into them. And the thing that I've really, really noticed has changed since the pandemic. The pandemic was a huge point, inflection point, where people picked up games again and suddenly understood, I see. I see why these are important. They're a really great route to connection between people and a route to fun. These are two really important things that humans need to do. And in our late capitalist world, everyone just works all the time. People don't make room for fun in their hearts a lot, and I think they need to. And games are a wonderful way to do that. And that's something I feel very, strongly about as the older I get, the more strongly I feel about games as actually a route to fun, a route to making space for play in your life.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's really important. And now when I go, I was on Radio 4 the other day talking with a philosopher and a sci-fi novelist, and nobody was like, so games, they're a bit silly though, aren't they? Or, oh, I don't play these things, but please talk to me about them. Every single person on that panel was, understood games and played them. And we just had a great conversation about video games on Radio 4. And I was like, my God, this could not be more different from being asked if I've ever read a book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think to a certain degree, time is winning the argument, because now everyone in their late 30s and 40s who, are now in positions of cultural power as gatekeepers they've all played video games. So there's not quite that sneeriness. But I think it's so right. We had to get to the point where, video games could be something that we could talk about seriously, so that we could seriously say some of them are really bad and embarrassing. And it's okay to say that, because now we understand that there can also be good ones. Whereas there was a time where it was just everyone's just trying to say, no, video games are good and important and blah, blah, blah. And that's not completely true, in the same way that it's not true with books or films. There's loads of garbage. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but, there was always a sense you were letting the side down, wasn't there? If you criticized any game, really, or game or something about games broadly, there was this weird sense of, or people would sort of behave as if you were betraying your own. You couldn't have a serious conversation if there wasn't room for criticism like that.
Yeah, and I think the audience as well, grew up, particularly in the noughties and even the 90s, grew up, the whole time being told their hobby is bad and embarrassing. So then when people start actually trying to engage with video games seriously and saying why some of them are bad, they're just knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, you just don't understand them. And actually, we've needed to get to a point where we can actually talk about them like adults, I suppose.
I agree. And the defensive posture that I still sometimes get it. I still sometimes get this instinctive defensive posture when I'm talking about games with someone who doesn't necessarily love them or get them. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful. But that, something you said there is true. Like we have finally aged into power, like the millennial and, younger Gen X people who grew up with games. This is why game movies and TV aren't terrible anymore, because those people are commissioning and then also writing and perhaps directing the things rather than people who don't understand it. And so games have become, they've become part of our cultural fabric now. And it's not no one's gonna take that away. Like, it's impossible now for that to be taken away. So we don't have to feel defensive all the time. As journalists or as just gamers and fans, we don't actually have to have this attitude of, being primed to defend the hobby. It's not necessary. We've grown out of that, and thank God, frankly, because it did limit discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like this is like a juicy PhD subject for someone in 2050. What we're talking about here.
Yeah. Not going to be me.
All right, let's come to your fifth and your final game, Keza. Tell us, it's not super recent, but it is. Oh no, it is super recent. Yeah, it's like five months old. Tell us, what's the game, Keza?
The game is Hollow Knight Silksong. I really liked the first Hollow Knight. I liked it a lot. And then obviously the developer disappeared for all those years and told us that a new Hollow Knight was coming. But then in a move that I deeply respect, just simply refused to engage at all in terms of hyping it, marketing it, being like, when's it coming out? And so Silksong became a kind of talismanic game, and I loved the way that it became something that people would just say Silksong under every, at the time E3 broadcast, every kind of direct, every state of play, every kind of marketing beat that the games industry had. Everybody would completely undermine it by talking about this weird little indie game about bugs. I found that very funny. I thought that was great. So I was looking forward to Silksong because I loved the game, but I was also looking forward to it as like a moment, as a wee culture. I thought it was going to be an interesting story. So the thing is that when Silksong did come out, I was badly injured. So it came out in, was it September or August? I think it was September 2024. Yeah.
25.
So it came out in September 25. Earlier that year, I'd basically just woken up one day with excruciating pain in my right arm and hand and shoulder. And it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Like really, terrible, terrible pain, like unbearably bad pain. Drugs would take just a tiny little bit of the edge off it, but it really was awful. I couldn't type, I couldn't work, I couldn't play games at all. I could barely do anything. And then it took a while for this to get diagnosed, but essentially I had an injury to my nerves. It's quite a rare one. It's called brachial neuritis, but it's an inflammation of the nerve path that travels from like the bottom of your neck all the way down your arm into your hand. And usually it's very, 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 very painful for a while. And then often the muscles and the nerves in your hand atrophy. And so you lose use of your hand for a while and your arm.
All right, gosh.
So this, for a person who makes a living from playing video games and from writing with my hands, I was like, it was a very serious thing to happen. Quite apart from it being just very hard to endure, it was also, I was very worried about my, long-term future if I lost use of my hand. So the good news was my hand was okay, but the pain was still pretty awful. So I had essentially the whole year I was dealing with this pretty gnarly pain. It got a bit better after a while, but it wasn't good and I couldn't work properly. And the Nintendo Switch 2 came out and I couldn't work properly. I was trying my hardest, but I just couldn't do it. And then they announced Hollow Knight Silksong was coming out and I was like, are you kidding me? After all this time, this game cannot be coming out at a time when I physically can't play it. That's so unfair. I just thought it was a cosmic joke. And so I had to learn to do things differently last year because I was disabled suddenly. And this is something that we all hope won't happen to us. but it happens to many, if not most of us, that there'll be a period of your life where you're impaired in some way, your health is bad in some way. So for me, this was what it was like. I couldn't use my arm, and I had to learn to do everything in my life differently without the use of this arm, and I had to learn to manage pain, and that involves being very slow, very deliberate, pacing yourself, like managing how you're feeling every day. That's not how I work. It's never been how I worked, and it's also not what video games have ever taught me. Video games have always taught me, keep going, just be really stubborn, throw yourself at it forever. You'll defeat Tower Knight. You'll, defeat expert mode on amplitudes. You'll beat Demon Souls. You just have to keep going and be really, really determined and indefatigable. And that's just not how pain works. Like you have to give in to pain, otherwise it just gets worse and worse. Like it's your body's defense, like alarm. And if you don't listen and you just keep going anyway, then it will just get louder and louder and louder. So I had to learn to play Silksong, one of the hardest games I've ever played and will ever play, in like 20-minute, half an hour chunks, because I couldn't do it for too long because it would hurt too much. It was just such an education for me, firstly in, why we need, accessibility options and different control schemes and stuff are really, really important. And I've always known that, but like having an experience like that where you really need some accommodations, it just brings it home how important it is to have games that work differently. I spent most of the year playing very chill games that didn't require much dexterity, but I was so determined to play Silksong. I was looking forward to it for so long. And I was having to play it in this way that felt very unnatural to me, where I wasn't just in there for 6 hours, like throwing myself at the same boss. I was properly pacing myself and going through it. And so that game lasted me for 6 months. I played it for 6 months, just a bit here and there every day. And the way that it made me feel was so different. Like, I love difficult games. They make me feel good. This made me feel bad a lot of the time, but I was so determined to do it anyway. And the reason I got through it was because it's just an exceptionally beautiful game. Like the way that it's designed, the obsession in every detail of that game. There's a bit Bellheart where you walk into the game kind of mirrors, it's a kind of Dante's journey from hell up to heaven, except you get to the Citadel, which is the heaven where you're supposed to be making your pilgrimage to, and it's horrible up there too. Everything's really bad up there. And so it kind of made me think about this concept, and because I was suffering myself, I thought about suffering and the concept of suffering, and going through the idea of a pilgrimage being suffering that brings you closer to the divine, giving suffering meaning. And then Silksong really kind of attacks that as an idea, and because every single step is just more suffering, and really the only way to stop is to stop the whole cycle. Like that's kind of the message of the game. And there's a lot of compassion in the game. Like I think the dialogue is very beautiful. The way it's presented is very, it leaves a lot of room for you to think about it. I was playing it in my head all the time because I couldn't play it for 6 hours. I was playing it in my head a lot of the time. So Silksong's going to be a game I remember for the rest of my life because I played it at that time, and it made me think about what games are for a bit differently. And it also sort of just happened to sort of spark a lot of really interesting thinking about the nature of suffering. But it's also just an extraordinary game. It's an extraordinary work, and you can tell that every single minute that's been spent on that game has been done with intention. And very few games these days have the luxury to be made that way. They tend to have to obviously work to commercial restraints. People get fired every dev cycle. The games industry at the moment is just generally on fire. So that is a counter narrative to all that as well. I just think it's a really special game, and it's one that I'll probably be playing on and off for the rest of my life. I think it's a real masterwork.
Oh, beautifully put, Keza. Amazing.
Thank you.
All right, let's go through your console. We've got Super Mario 64, Amplitude, Demon's Souls, The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Hollow Knight, Silksong. Definitely a lot of challenge there. I can tell that you like difficult games.
Well, I always will. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about it. I even finished Baby Steps, which is just a thing only insane people would do.
We need a name for your console. Have you had any thoughts what we might call it?
I'm just going to be really embarrassing, and I think I'm going to call it the Super Keztendo.
Very good. Super Keztendo. How one Scottish journalist helped the world have fun.
I love it.
Very good. All right, Keza, this has been great. One last question, right? I know your Guardian email address is a complete bin fire because you tell me never to email because you won't see it.
Honestly, it's impossible. I get 600 emails a day. I just can't. I don't know how you're supposed to. Anyway,
yeah,
it's bad.
Well, I mean, yeah. So some of those people, I mean, many of them are PR people trying to get you to write about their game on the Guardian, but some of them are people pitching you stories. So yeah, what is it that you know, with a pitch, what makes you sit up and think, oh, this is something interesting, and what are the common mistakes?
I think the common mistakes are people pitching me their perspective on something that's happening or a game, but their perspective without telling me why their perspective is particularly important or interesting. So you know, I think that that's a very common pitch I get is like, oh, how this game helped me with this, or what I think of this game, and I'm like, that's great, but like, what is it that, you know, really makes that stand out from a lot of very, very similar articles that we have all read. And then what I'm always actually looking for is just a little bit of reporting. It's very, very easy actually to distinguish oneself by just doing reporting, going and speaking to people and finding like an original angle on something just by speaking to others. I think every single editor in the whole games media at the moment is desperate for, you know, reporting. And if that is, I think anybody would take a good story that's based on really doing a bit of digging and investigating. People pay well for that as well. It's always worth doing.
Yeah. Leave the house. That's the message.
Leave the house. Pick up the phone.
Pick up the phone.
Do these
get
two
outside, and you'll put yourself in the 1%.
Exactly. Yes. I don't blame people because there's not that much training, is there? Like, you don't get the training in reporting that you used to, but you know, you have to do it yourself now. It's harder, but there are editors who will always be really happy to work with anyone who's got that desire.
Yeah, but on the flip side, I suppose it's easier than ever to technically get hold of people around the world, isn't it? So, you know, swings around about.
Exactly,
so.
Yeah. That's true.
Keza, it's been amazing. The book is Super Nintendo, How One Japanese Company Helped the World Have Fun, which you can buy wherever you get your books. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story and for your book and for all the work you've done. It's amazing.
No, thank you, Simon. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much to my guest, Keza Macdonald, the author of Super Nintendo, How One Japanese Company Helped the World Have Fun. Here it is. If you're watching on video, you can see I'm holding up my advanced copy of this very fine book. It's on the back cover. It has a blurb here from Tom Bissell, former guest of the show. Tom came on My Perfect Console in the first year of the show coming out, and it's one of my favourite episodes we've ever put out. Go back and listen to it if you've yet to. Tom writes of Keza's book, among the best things ever written about Nintendo. Then that's high praise indeed. Coming from Tom Bissell, who is just a wonderful writer, of course, in his own right. Yeah, as I mentioned on that chat, just really love the way that Keza has structured this book. It's not trying to tell the history of Nintendo, back from the late 1800s up until today. The approach she takes is each chapter is based around a different character, a different series. So, for example, there's one on Super Mario, of course, one on Legend of Zelda, but also Metroid, Pokemon, Kirby, Wii Sports. And, Keza tells the story of those games, of those characters, interweaves quotations from the interviews that she's conducted over her career with some of the creators at Nintendo. It's a really, really good book, worth your time. It's got a lovely, attractive cover as well. And the Super Nintendo, as you can see, is in this sort of glittery typeface. Really nice product. Go out and buy it. As I say, wherever you get your books, you'll be able to pick up a copy. Add it to your game book shelf. I'm sure you've got one if you're listening to this. And if not, why not start one right now with Keza's book? I don't really have too many things to pick up with from our conversation there. Of course, Keza and I have been friends for a long time, so I hope that didn't feel too inside baseball-y at all. I don't think it did. Keza was, of course, mainly telling the story of her life and career. I have known her for a very long time. Definitely more than 15 years now. And back when, we were both freelancing for Eurogamer at the time and Edge and places like that. And yeah, we've been away on a couple of trips as well together, game trips, that is. And so, as Keza mentioned, we had the privilege in, I think it was 2016, visiting From Software at the time that they were making Bloodborne, a popular pick on my perfect console, of course, because it's one of the finest games ever. And yeah, we were very fortunate that we got to go and meet Miyazaki and have a tour around the studio. They don't really do that anymore, I don't think, From Software. They didn't do it with Elden Ring, but back in those days, I've had the privilege of visiting their studio twice in my career. Once for the first Dark Souls, back when they were, still in that period that Keza was talking about in that conversation, where they were kind of known, but in a, slightly, if you know type way. And then Dark Souls came out and changed everything. So, I got to go at that point back when Miyazaki, the director of those games, was just an employee. And then these days, of course, prior to Elden Ring or post Elden Ring, he now runs the company. So, I had last year, one of the listeners wrote to me and said, "Why haven't you had Keza on the show before? Do you guys have beef?" Well, we don't have beef. I was just waiting for her book to be ready and to come out, because it seemed like a good time to get her on to talk about that. Similarly, lots of people have written to me before and said, "Why haven't I had my good friend Christian Donlan on?" Again, another sort of British writer who's covered games for a long time, was at Eurogamer for many years, now is freelance again. And I will be having Chris on at some point, don't worry. He's got a game-related book coming out soon. I don't think it's been announced yet, so I'm not going to say what it is, but as soon as that's imminent, I'll invite him on the show as well. I hope you enjoyed that. Like I say, don't really have many things to pick up with there. So, just say if you are enjoying listening to this, but you would perhaps like to watch it, I understand if you don't. I prefer to listen to my podcast and not watch them. But we are putting out video podcasts because apparently more people like to watch podcasts than listen to them. That's what we're all being told anyway, in the arms race that is the contemporary podcast landscape. So you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/myperfectconsole, and there you will be able to watch these episodes as well. And they are, trying to keep the quality up high. It's not just sticking a camera on. We do have footage from each of the games that is picked by a guest, and I bring in photographs, relevant footage basically for whatever the guest is talking about. So hopefully if you're the kind of person who likes to watch podcasts, then it's worth your while. That's patreon.com/myperfectconsole. You'll also, as well as getting video episodes, you'll get your episodes early and ad free. And you also get a bonus episode once a month with myself and the comedian Glenn Moore, who was a guest on the show in the first year, and then has very kindly, been a kind of co-host for some of these Patreon support episodes. Of course, Glenn has his own very successful comedy video games podcast called Button Boys that he does with Pierre Novelli and with Sarah Keyworth, both of whom are previous guests on My Perfect Console as well. So go and listen to that. I'm sure you already support Button Boys, but if you don't, it's very funny and very good. So yes, that's Patreon. What else? You can follow us on social media. We are on Blue Sky and X, Instagram and TikTok, and putting out little clips now that we've got video stuff on some of those platforms. So do give us a follow, and you get little previews of who's coming up next week and things like that. Big thanks to the team at Big Games Machine for their support in running the socials. Thank you. They're very supportive, and big thanks to them. Give them a follow. If you're the kind of person who is in the market for some games PR, then check out their website. It's Big Games Machine. You can also write to me at myperfectconsole@gmail.com. Thank you so much to all of you that have been sending in your suggestions for guests this year. Really, honestly, if I invited everyone who you've suggested, that would fill up the whole year. So I'm so grateful. Please do keep doing that. Lots of the names come up time and time again, and I am inviting guests on. In fact, I am recording in a few days' time with someone who one of the listeners wrote in and said, "Hey, have you checked out this person? You should get them on. They've got a book out. They're very interesting. They like games." And so, yeah, they agreed to come on. So, yeah, it does work. The system works. Loads of the guests that I have on the show are people that you have suggested. So, yeah, please do continue to do that. That's myperfectconsole@gmail.com. Right. Next week, shall I reveal next week's guest? Next week, I have on the show Tom Keegan. Now, Tom is perhaps not a name that will be known to you, but you almost certainly have played video games that he has had an instrumental role in. That's because he's one of the leading performance directors in video games. He's, his career started out in theatre, film, kids animation. He worked on things like the Powerpuff Girls, Johnny Bravo, the Woody Woodpecker Show, things like that. But then he moved into video games at really a pivotal moment in the industry's evolution. He was shaping the performances in Chronicles of Riddick. Do you remember that? Probably one of the best film tie-in video games back when they made those, apart from GoldenEye 007. So yeah, he worked on that. Battlefield, Resident Evil 2, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, Survivor, and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. He's BAFTA nominated for his work on Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. And yeah, so just, he's directed all of the great voice actors in video games, and he gets into all of that. He's got a book out called The Complete Guide to Video Game Performance Directing. Niche, but very, very interesting. And I'm so grateful for him to coming on the show, and very grateful I'm very excited to share his insights. We've not had a performance director on before. I have of course had voice actors on like Ashley Birch. Excuse me. I have had voice actors on like Ashley Birch, of course, and Jennifer Hale, but this is my first performance director. So yeah, join us next week and listen to Tom. You're in for a real treat. Okay, well, all that remains for me to say is, give us a like, a subscribe if you don't already. Patreon.com/myperfectconsole. And I will be back again next week with Tom with his 5 games. So with one more Perfect Console.